but we can go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Stewart. I'm the Climate Change Program Manager at the Maryland Department of the Environment, and I'm joined by Dr. Kathleen Kennedy at the University of Maryland. And tonight, Kathleen and I are going to talk about Maryland's climate pathway, and I'll provide some context in just a few minutes for what this meeting is about and what we hope to get out of it. I wanted to start off, though, and ask if we have any elected officials or staff of elected officials joining us this morning, and if you wanted to take a moment to introduce yourself. Okay, hearing none. And feel free also, if you'd like to introduce yourself, if you care to, in the chat. So tonight we are going to talk a little bit about the background of the Climate Solutions Now Act in Maryland and what set us on this path to work with the University of Maryland in creating what they've called Maryland's Climate Pathway, which is embodied in a report that was released in June. And Dr. Kennedy will go through some of the core findings of their study for Maryland. And then we're going to leave a lot of time in tonight's program for a listening session so that MDE can receive comments and questions from you all that helps the state inform its policy decisions as we come around to needing to finalize the state's plan to achieve its GHG reduction goals. I'm sorry, its climate pollution or greenhouse gas emission reduction goals by 2031. That plan is due this December. So, you know, basic context, I'm sure many of you are aware, and of course, we're fortunate to be doing this work in Maryland that has a long history of climate action, public that has routinely been among the most concerned and educated about climate change in the U.S. population. So we've got a lot of solid ground to build on. So many of you may already know that Maryland has been warming faster than the rest of the U.S. on average. As we get warmer weather, evaporation increases that leads to greater precipitation. One challenge, though, is that as weather patterns change, that heavy precipitation is happening in more intense moments and in heavier rainfall events. So we have periods of drought followed by periods of extreme weather, which is leading to some devastating impacts, including, of course, flooding that's affecting Maryland communities. Of course, the effects of climate change are much broader than just inland flooding. You know, I grew up in Maryland, and you know, throughout the 80s, my family and I would go skiing out in Western Maryland or right across the border in Pennsylvania. The ski industry today in the Mid-Atlantic is a fraction of what it once was. I now can't routinely bank on there being snow if I have a weekend available to, you know, take my kids to the slopes. I have a nephew struggling with Lyme disease, which is a disease where the ticks that carry Lyme are expanding in their range as their habitat is growing. Their range is growing, largely driven by climate change. I've got family in historic Ellicott City that have been displaced twice by so-called 500-year storms back to back in the course of 2 years. I've got friends and family who have, you know, homes along the coastline of our Chesapeake Bay or in Ocean City, Maryland, communities that are all being affected by sea level rise and decreasing property values as insurance companies are backing out from insuring properties that are in flood areas, so on and so forth, right? We all experience climate change in a lot of different ways, almost every day. And these are among the reasons why Maryland's lawmakers have been very keen on addressing climate change at its root cause for some time now. So Maryland has reduced greenhouse gas emissions or climate pollution faster than almost any other state in the nation. Yes, faster than California. And a big part of the story there is that in 2006, we had 18 coal-fired power plants in Maryland. Today, we have 3. We're on a trajectory to have none. When I was growing up, And in fact, up until pretty recently, Maryland had the worst air quality east of the Mississippi. We now are in compliance with all of the national air quality standards as of last year, first year in recorded history that we met all those standards. Public health is significantly improving as we're addressing climate change, as we're cleaning up the air. The public health benefits are among the significant co-benefits of the work that we're doing. Maryland also strives to continue to lead the nation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have the most ambitious goals of any U.S. state, aiming to achieve a 60% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2031 and achieve net zero emissions by 2045. That net zero by 2045 is aligned with a couple of other states that have also set that same ambitious long-term goal. So how will the state do it? That's the big question in front of us this year. It was in 2022 that the General Assembly passed the Climate Solutions Now Act. In 2023, this is our planning year, trying to get input from scientists like Dr. Kennedy, input from stakeholders and the public to figure out what should the new policies be to achieve these goals. So let me hand it over to Dr. Kennedy to talk about the analysis that her team did to guide the state's decisions.
Thanks, Mark. So the goal of the Maryland's Climate Pathway Report was to model a pathway to meet the state goals that Mark just laid out. So to do this, we analyzed two different scenarios. First is a current policy scenario. So this is everything that's currently on the books in Maryland, in addition to relevant federal policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act. And this scenario lets us see how close we are to the goal already. And under that scenario, we see Maryland achieving 51% reductions by 2031. So this is already a good start, but there is still a gap to meet that 60% goal. Our second scenario is the Maryland's Climate Pathway scenario. And in this, we keep all of those current policies, but we also layer on top of those additional policies that can help the state reach the 60% goal. This is a comprehensive approach that includes reductions from all sectors of the economy, and it also follows an all-of-society approach where we think about how all levels of government can work together, federal, state, local, in addition to non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, and individuals all working together to make this pathway a reality. Next slide. So starting with a little bit of context here, this is the trajectory of Maryland emissions over time. It starts on the left with 2006. This is the state's baseline year. So whenever we talk about percent reductions, it's always relative to 2006 levels. And you can see, as Mark already mentioned, that Maryland has been reducing emissions steadily over time. But the 2031 goal and the 2045 net zero goal will require increased ambition still. So the main focus of this report was on the 2031 60% reduction goal. So that's what I'm going to talk about most of the time here. But I will mention a few things that are relative to the 2045 goal as well. So this figure is basically a summary of the pathway to reach that 2031 60% reduction goal. And so the first thing to note, again, on the left, we have 2006. Click the next slide. So this is the baseline 2006 levels of emissions in Maryland. Next, if you look on the right, you can see the 2031 levels that we need to reach to achieve the 60% reductions. So how do we get there? The first step is looking at what Maryland has already achieved, the historical reductions you see there in green. And this puts us right at halfway there. Maryland's already achieved 30% of that 60. Next, you see all of these bars going across the slide. So each of these is a different sector of the Maryland economy. And in each of these, you'll see two different shades of the colors. So the light shading on top is the reductions that sector can achieve under the current policies scenario. The darker shading on the bottom is from the Maryland's Climate Pathway scenario with those additional policies that we layered in to reach the goal. So next, I'm going to step through each of these sectors and talk about what those additional policies were. So beginning with the electricity sector, we modeled an 89% reduction in emissions for this sector. The chart you see here, you'll see one like this for each of the sectors. The dashed line on top is for the current policies emissions, and the shaded areas are the emissions under Maryland's climate pathway. And so you can see how those diverge as we go forward in time. The additional reductions in this sector were due to a 100% clean energy sources standard by 2035. This involves collaboration both across Maryland to achieve this, as well as with neighboring states to make sure that not only the energy produced here in Maryland is clean, but also the energy that we import from outside of Maryland. This also requires thinking about boosting renewable energy deployment and accessibility through things like federal solar energy tax credits. Next, we have the transportation sector. Here we modeled a 49% reduction in emissions. This comes from things like smart growth and zoning reform, which can help reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. We also have to think about how to ensure access to state and federal incentives that can support the EV transition. We also modeled the adoption of California's Clean Fleets regulation, which applies to heavy-duty vehicles for freight. We also modeled 100% electric bus sales by 2025, as well as some electrification of non-road sources. So this includes things like lawnmowers or commercial forklifts. Next, we have the building sector. Here we modeled a 35% reduction in emissions. This comes from a zero emissions appliance standard, which in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, can also improve indoor air quality and safety. We also modeled a zero emissions construction standard for new buildings, and we extended the energy efficiency standards that the state already has in place farther into the future. Next, we have the industrial sector. Here we modeled a 79% reduction in emissions. This comes from buy clean standards for manufactured products that can support cleaner production methods such as electrification. We also model a switch in fuel use for the cement industry away from coal. And this is actually a switch that is already in progress. So there are 2 cement facilities in Maryland, and both of them have internal corporate goals to reduce their emissions and are looking at ways to switch away from coal already. And last, we include the manufacturing sector in all of these decarbonization efforts. So currently there is an exemption for the manufacturing sector from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. So part of our scenario is removing that exemption so that the sector fully participates in all of these programs. Next, we have the industrial processes and product use sector. So this is a bit different from the slide I just showed. The previous one was all about fuel combustion in industry. Here, the emissions come not from fuel use, but rather from things like chemical reactions or from use of the product itself. So this sector saw a 46% reduction in our scenario. This comes from lower process-related emissions, again in cement manufacturing. We also model some use of carbon capture and storage to reduce cement emissions beyond 2035. So that's one of the things that we don't necessarily expect to contribute to the 2031 goal because it is still a developing technology, but it could contribute to that net zero goal in 2045. And last, we model a reduction in non-CO2 emissions from air conditioning and refrigeration. This is particularly important because non-CO2s are often more difficult to abate than carbon dioxide itself. So really getting at some of those emissions can be very important. Next. Here we're looking at the fossil fuel sector. We modeled a 26% reduction here. This comes from reducing natural gas use overall across all of the sectors that I'm showing, but also comes from widespread monitoring of natural gas infrastructure. And particularly with this sector, we want to think about how to do this while ensuring affordability and no increased costs to Marylanders, particularly vulnerable communities, as part of this transition. Next. Here we have the waste management sector. We modeled a 40% reduction in this sector, and this comes from increased recycling and waste diversion away from landfills, and in particular, improved access to strategies like composting. And next, we have the agriculture sector. Here we modeled a 9% reduction in emissions. This is a bit smaller than some of the other sectors, partly because the agriculture sector is a smaller emitter in the first place. And also Maryland farmers have already been implementing climate smart practices for some time now. So here we model continued use of those climate smart practices, as well as some new zero-cost mitigation opportunities in the livestock sector. So these would be things that either are cost savings or break even for Maryland farmers, no increased costs. And the last sector is the forestry and land use sector. So this one is a bit different from the others because, as you can see on this graph, all of the numbers here are negative. So this indicates that the sector is actually sequestering more emissions than it releases. So this is a net sink for greenhouse gas emissions. So the 2031 goal for the state is a gross emissions goal, meaning it doesn't count these negative emissions, and this sector is not included in that goal. But for the 2045 net zero goal, we're looking to balance positive and negative emissions so that it reaches net zero. So this sector is particularly important for reaching that net zero goal, and we want to make sure we're protecting and expanding these natural sinks. And future analysis will expand on this some because this report focused on the 2031 goal, which doesn't include this sector. We didn't model this as intensively as the others. Next, we have a policy that applies to all of the sectors that I just talked through, and it's a cap and invest program. And here the idea is that the proceeds from this program will be reinvested to support Marylanders, and this program overall delivers 4% emissions reduction toward that 60% goal. Next, we find that this pathway can deliver significant benefits to Marylanders. So this is a quick snapshot of what some of those benefits are. On the climate side, we do model the 60% emissions reduction goal, meeting that goal as part of the scenario. This can help Maryland contribute to national and global reduction goals as well. But importantly, it also brings reductions in co-pollutants that have important health benefits. So the middle column here is a quick look at some of those health benefits that are specifically tied to 2031 emissions. And in 2031, we would expect to see up to 1,000 fewer cases of upper and lower respiratory symptoms, up to 51 lives saved, and over 16,500 fewer days of restricted activity from pollution. Last, there's also economic benefits to this plan. So in the final column, you'll see cumulative numbers now through 2031 from the present day. Those health benefits total up to about $1 to $2.4 billion in that time period. We also expect to see 16,700 new jobs created and a $1.5 billion increase in personal income. Next. So here I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk not just about what these policies are, but how we can think about implementing them in Maryland. So each sector has some unique opportunities and considerations, and so I'm going to just step through each of those briefly. First, in the electricity sector, decarbonization of this sector can also enable decarbonization of other sectors where electrification is a key strategy. So for instance, if you have clean electricity, that makes running your electric vehicle also cleaner. But we want to make sure that this is an equitable transition within the sector and that everyone has equal access to the incentives that are part of that transition. In the transportation sector, we want to think about how to overcome barriers to the electric vehicle transition and how to reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. Affordability is a really key consideration for the sector, making sure that everyone has access to an electric vehicle who wants one. We also want to think about access to charging infrastructure so that those particularly who may not own their own home and be able to install their own charger can still charge their vehicle. And finally, we want to think about access to public transit so that there are other ways to get around in addition to an electric vehicle or other car. In the building sector, we want efficient and clean building technologies to be available to everyone. So again, affordability is a key concern here. And we also want to think about access both for those who own their own home and those who rent. Next, in the industrial sector, we know decarbonization in this sector can sometimes be challenging, but there is a large untapped potential here. And really key to accessing that potential is stakeholder engagement, working with those companies, such as the cement industry I mentioned earlier, who already have sustainability goals and are working toward those already. We also want to consider the research and innovation needs for the sector. So for those areas where we may not have a perfect solution yet, supporting the development of new technologies that can fill that need. Waste management is an opportunity to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. It also comes with significant equity implications. In particular, action here can significantly reduce pollution and the associated health harms. And we want to think about how also to divert waste such that we just have a smaller amount of waste going to landfills in the first place. The land and agriculture sector policies can also contribute to reductions while supporting other state goals, such as supporting the Chesapeake Bay. So here policies can improve soil health, they can preserve and expand the forest sinks that I talked about, and they can also improve water and air quality. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thanks, Kathleen. So we are going to pivot to really hearing from you and getting any questions that you have about any of the content that Kathleen presented, or any input that you'd like to share with MDE regarding some of these policy decisions that are in front of us. But before turning to that, did want to note that if you're not comfortable sharing your comments live tonight, we do encourage you to submit them online. We're accepting written comments through October 15th. If you go to mde.maryland.gov/climate change, then you can find a link to submit written comments. And with that, I see a number of people raising their hands already for comments, which is wonderful. We had one person right at the beginning of the call ask to make a comment. So if Ann Bristow is still with us, then she is first up.
I am still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Hey there. And I'm not able to be on camera with the bandwidth that we have out here. My comments are on behalf of Mountain Maryland Movement, which is an all-volunteer group in Allegheny and Garrett counties. And we wanted to focus on woody biomass, not that there aren't other areas of the report that are worthy of comment, but our coal extraction and the predominance of our forests out here, I think, warrant special attention to this part of the state. We have environmental justice concerns from a legacy of coal extraction that has both polluted our air and degraded streams to the extent that they cannot be used for drinking water. Our concerns with focusing on woody biomass in the future, and I understand that the modeling for that is perhaps not as precise as in other areas. It was hard to tell, but particularly modeling around forests. But I wanted to at least contribute to the conversation by being sure that there's an understanding that combustion of woody biomass is not carbon neutral and may even be worse than burning coal. Burning wood for energy is also inefficient. Biomass has been found to, per unit of energy, less efficient than both coal or gas. California air quality studies show that burning woody biomass is more polluting than burning coal, and both have the same level of planet heating carbon dioxide emissions. I bring this up because Mark mentioned earlier in the call that there are only 3 plants continuing to burn coal in Maryland. One of those is AES Warrior Run, which is in south of Cumberland, Maryland. And in November of 2022, Maryland approved a pilot trial at AES Warrior Run in which a mix of coal and woody biomass would be combusted for electricity. We tried to get the results of this pilot test, which were to have been conducted in April of this year, and have not received an answer from MDE. I'm concerned that this report should include the results of that, since combustion of woody biomass is part of the electricity generation mix. Pathways should not project buildup of combustion of woody biomass for electricity generation to meet greenhouse gas reduction goals. Pathways should recommend ending renewable energy credits for biomass combustion. In terms of the integrity of the forests in Western Maryland, we have over 2/3 of state forested land out in our two westernmost counties. Both counties are excluded from the Forest Conservation Act. We'd also recommend that Pathways recommend amendments to the Forest Conservation Act to include Allegheny and Garrett counties. It seems, it doesn't make sense to me that we would be planting 5 million trees when we know that seedlings do not sequester as much carbon. Young trees do not sequester as much carbon as mature trees, and at the same time not preserve the extensive forest network that we have. We also would ask that Pathways define woody biomass, because woody biomass is not just standing trees or tree waste from trees that are taken. Woody biomass is also the network of trees with one another and with mycorrhizal networks in the soil that are extremely efficient sinks for carbon. And I don't want to take up a lot more time. I could go on more. I'm going to submit this to you in writing. Thank you for your attention and for allowing me to offer these comments.
Thank you very much. We appreciate those comments. I mentioned this earlier. If you've joined since then, we're recording tonight's session. It'll be posted on MDE's YouTube channel later. I noticed one thing here. We've got 17 hands up right now to make comments. So thank you for lining up to make comments. Let's try to keep comments to 2 minutes max. That'd be great. And if you're an organization that has shared comments during one of these listening sessions already, appreciate if you don't repeat comments that you've already given to MDE, but feel free to add new commentary. So next up would be, let's see, Mary Beth Carosa. Oh, Mary Beth, you haven't unmuted. The little microphone button on there.
Good evening.
Thank you.
I want to first thank the Maryland Department of Environment for hosting this forum. I am a state senator representing District 38, which is the Lower Eastern Shore, but I'm also a member of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee. And I wanted to make 2 points. One, our chair, Brian Feldman, recently arranged for the members of our committee to go up to visit. It was a first for me, PJM, the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland electric grid infrastructure for all 13 states. And I wanted to share this with MDE and encourage MDE to have direct conversations with PJM about the reliability concerns that they raised during our meeting. It was clear that it appeared that our policies are running ahead of our capacity, our grid infrastructure. And when they went through, I thought in a very organized way, pointing out both, they had some immediate concerns, immediate meaning now, and then short-term and long-term concerns. And I think providing some insights that if we are going to ensure that there is reliability for our constituents when it comes to what they expect day in and day out, turning on that light switch and knowing that the system will be there for them. They are, raising questions that, the capacity issues really need to be looked at. So my request is that MDE follow up with our committee specifically on the concerns that PJM raised when we visited them in person. Second issue is the battery electric cars, and looking at the full scope of the environmental impact, including the upstream factors, are not beneficial. And there's a report by the Manhattan Institute where, you know, really goes into that the fact that we don't know how much, if at all, emissions will decline as EV use rises. And, you know, I think when we have access to these type of professional studies and institutes and that are raising these type of issues, that we have to balance what we're talking about, our goals, and then realistically what is achievable. So I just, again, being on the committee that has oversight and seeing that we have policies that have already been approved, and now some legitimate questions being raised about the grid and the infrastructure and capacity and reliability, we as policymakers serving our constituents will need to address some of these, you know, maybe on some narrowly focused issues. So wanted to bring that to MDE's attention tonight, especially the timeliness, because we're just coming off of our visit to PJM. And I think there was really a lot of very important information that our committee would like to work with you on.
Thank you, Senator Cardoza. Very helpful. Next is James Wang.
Hi, this is James from Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm a climate scientist, and I wanted to raise an issue regarding the implementation of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So, and specifically, it's about the use of RECs, or renewable energy certificates. So currently, a lot of suppliers in the state satisfy their RPS requirements by purchasing out-of-state RECs, such as from the Midwest, where there's a plentiful supply of cheap RECs from wind power. And so I wonder whether the purchase of these cheap RECs is actually not having much of an impact in terms of promoting additional renewable energy generation or retiring fossil fuel power plants. And so I'm wondering whether the model results for the electricity sector may be overly optimistic because it doesn't treat these RECs very precisely. And so maybe maybe the use of RECs, it may actually hamper reductions in overall greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. And I think that may be especially the case for the current policies scenario. Maybe with the stronger policies in the Maryland's climate pathway, that might help to ease some of these potential issues with the RECs. But also, I wanted to point out there could be weaknesses or drawbacks to RGGI as well if things like offsets are allowed. So, thanks. I just wanted to raise those issues, and I was wondering whether those can be better addressed in the report.
Yeah, thanks for flagging those issues, James. And you know, one thing that everyone should be aware of is that, you know, President Biden has set a goal for 100% clean power by 2035. Governor Moore has set a goal for 100% clean power by 2035. Yet the specifics about those goals and policies are not yet set in stone, right? So there's a process underway, at least in Maryland, to determine what would achievement of 100% clean power by 2035 look like. So a lot of those questions that you raised, James, regarding you know, the role of RECs, for instance, in policy design, are very much on the table. You know, we are very interested in hearing the input like that you just shared on that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Stuart Simon.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
So what First, just a quick side note to the legislator who just spoke. In places disparate in the past year, places disparate as Texas, Vermont, and Hawaii, when the utilities were up against it and had to come up with creative solutions to stabilize their network using clean energy, they found ways to do it, mostly by relying on batteries with decentralized solar power. And legislator should look at that before she thinks it can't be done and believe what PJM says. But pivoting to what I really wanted to talk about, when you talk about cars, instead of just focusing on electric cars for a good portion of Maryland's population, I don't know if it's a third, probably around a third, for all the more densely populated urban areas, bikes, electric bikes, e-bikes, including cargo bikes, should be a major part of the mix. And to do that, you should create both bike pathways wide enough for such things as cargo bikes, but also to create incentives. Could be clunkers for a subsidy for e-bikes or a straight subsidy. The advantage is that you could then have the fewer cars you have, the more space you have for, to put in pathways for pedestrians and for e-bikes, for alternatives to electric cars, which are way more energy efficient, obviously using way less. How do you finance the decreased? Also, could help solve from the other side the issue of financing the decrease in funds from fuel sales, and therefore you don't have the money to put into mass transit. All parking spots should be taxed. All potential parking spots, even in front of a residential house in the street, should be taxed. They don't want it taxed, then create a bike path there. But there's no reason. You want to have, on one hand, you want to have as little impermeable surface as possible to reduce the heat island effect, right? And have more carbon absorption, because then you have less impermeable surface, more ground supply and trees. On the other hand, you also want to create disincentives for cars and incentives for the alternatives. Anyway, it's not pie in the sky. It's done throughout Europe. It's being done right now in DC.
Thank you. And as a Maryland cyclist, I agree. There's room for improvement with our bike infrastructure. So thank you. Next is Shannon. Is it Brush or Shea?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I am also a cyclist and in the Rockville Bicycle Advisory Committee, so I certainly support that. And I especially support the state finding ways to improve state roads. Those are often the ones that are actually the most dangerous in terms of pedestrian and cyclist things, like Maryland 355, that's otherwise known as Rockville Pike, that the city of Rockville is not allowed to basically touch because it's a state road. Old Georgetown Road, which recently had bike lanes put in. We thank you for that. And then similarly, not supporting the expansion of 270, which will just increase the amount of car traffic. My other concern is that it relies heavily on the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are very important. But the Inflation Reduction Act also has a lot of issues with environmental justice and economic justice. A number of them rely on federal tax refunds, which means that people need both a tax liability to qualify and the money to buy the technology to wait to be reimbursed, which is not fair to those and cuts off those who do not have those two things, which are most people. And it also heavily incentivizes and prioritizes homeowners, which excludes renters and does not incentivize people who own the buildings to make those changes. And so anything that Maryland can do to provide incentives right at the point of sale for any kind of energy efficient, whether that's an e-bike or an electric vehicle or an energy efficient appliance or a heat pump, et cetera, would help a lot with that. And then overall, and I know this is mentioned, but talk about collaboration and coordination with local communities, especially places that have been historically marginalized. Prioritize energy efficient improvements that reduce costs, distributed renewable energy that improves grid resiliency, and projects that improve both public safety and greenhouse gas reduction, such as street trees, green spaces, and improved roads. I would especially recommend looking at the work that the urban integrated field laboratory supported by the Department of Energy is doing in Baltimore, as they're setting not standards, but they're doing science on what are the most effective efforts to both increase resiliency for adaptation, as well as reduce greenhouse gases in urban environments. The project's led by Johns Hopkins, I believe.
Great,
And
thank you.
yep, and I think that was state roads. Yep. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And let me take a moment to acknowledge that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change has been doing a lot of thinking about incentive design and is forwarding a recommendation around point of sale rebates. So there's a lot of talk about the value of point of sale versus tax refund style rebates. So that's in their mindset. And a quick acknowledgement, one of the commission co-chairs, Kim Coble, is with us on the line. So thanks, Kim, for all the good work that you do. Next, I see a hand up from Mike O'Halloran. Good seeing you, Mike.
Hey there. Sorry about the delay, and thank you, Mark. Always good to chat with you. As I said, my name is Mike O'Halloran, and I am representing the Mid-Atlantic Petroleum Distributors Association. And on behalf of MAPTA, I submitted a number of questions for public comment and response by the department. So to respect everyone's time this evening, I won't repeat them here, but look forward to the department's responses, obviously. But I'll leave by saying this: our members truly believe in the importance and critical need of a diversified and balanced energy portfolio that is not reliant on a sole source. Our industry continues to invest in energy efficiency and improve our environmental impact. And considering industry assets and investments as negligible as much of the report does, it would certainly be a monumental oversight. And worse, it would put Marylanders at an unnecessary risk. Again, we look forward to continue our partnership with the department and finding ways that our industry can work collaboratively towards meeting the state's goals.
Thanks, Mike. I see a hand from the George Aguilar.
Hey, yes, it's Jorge Aguilar.
Hey, Jorge, thanks.
So yeah, hey, hey, so I want to thank MDE for having this listening session, and really appreciate Mr. Stewart and Dr. Kennedy for that PowerPoint to walk us through the report. So yes, I'm Jorge with Food and Water Watch. I'm here representing 50,000 supporters in the state, and really here to support the governor's really ambitious plan to reach 100% by 2035. We are excited by the boldness and how ambitious it is. And I know the report lays out a lot of different sections across multiple sectors, but we're particularly excited about language in there that speaks to phasing out coal and even natural gas plants as sources of generating electricity by 2031. So we are really looking at working with the administration on really implementing an aggressive climate plan to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions from those facilities in particular. We were somewhat concerned about the inclusion in that energy production section, though, of something called carbon capture technologies, which we believe is really a scam that the fossil fuel industry is pitching very, very hard right now. So far, carbon capture has failed to meet any of the industry's promises, and is clearly a way for the fossil fuel industry to get tens of millions of dollars from us, right, from taxpayer subsidies, so that we can keep dependent on these fossil fuel facilities like gas, natural gas, since the technology actually needs 30 to 40% more energy to run, which means more fossil fuels. So it's not something that we should be subsidizing in Maryland. Again, a lot of detail in the report about how carbon capture might be employed. We think you should just scratch it all together. I also want to talk a little bit about a coalition we're part of, 60 plus groups, really fighting to remove dirty energy sources like trash incineration, woody biomass, and even poultry waste to energy, which right now count as renewables in Maryland. So that means as taxpayers we're also subsidizing these dirty energy sources that all have all sorts of issues. And we call them renewables in Maryland. In page 81 of the report, actually MDE seems to supported of the expansion of biomass in the state for energy production. So we totally disagree with that. For those unfamiliar, right, this means burning trees, calling it energy, burning trash, calling it renewable energy. When it comes to animal biogas, it is methane derived from anaerobic digesters of animal waste. Not really mentioned directly in the report, but we do hear the emphasis on these bio-based fuels. I think the important thing to note here, as y'all did discuss a little bit about protecting the Chesapeake Bay, really in order for this animal waste biogas project to be successful, at scale, waste would have to come from outside of Maryland, right, from other states in the region. So we'd have to be disposing of even more waste, and this is waste that creates runoff issues that further pollute the Chesapeake Bay and other local waterways. So why in the world would we do this as a project, call it a renewable? So just something we don't want to get to be a part of. We should just eliminate biogas as a renewable altogether. So yeah, I think, again, we applaud what MDE is doing. We should be decreasing our dependence on fossil fuels. We really hope MDE truly reaches this 100% renewable and clean renewable energy by 2035. And we take a stand against some of these polluters who I think for a long time have sort of paraded themselves as clean energy when in fact there are all sorts of justice issues, health issues associated with them. So with that,
Thank you.
we'll give you your time back.
Thank you, Jorge. Can I ask quickly if Food and Water Watch has a perspective on the role of you expressed your concern about CCS or carbon capture and storage for power generators. Does Food and Water Watch have the same concern about CCS at cement manufacturing facilities? And the reason I raise it is that CCS is often identified as really a critical pathway for cement manufacturing to decarbonize.
I think in general, the question is that carbon capture has not actually worked across really many of the sectors. We're particularly troubled by how much it's failed in the energy production. But if you look at it, there is a lot of research and marketing by some of the folks doing carbon capture, but there's not a lot of projects out there that have actually worked, right, or have clearly shown, right, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it's not just the greenhouse gas emissions, it is what other factors, even inserting the carbon capture contribute. So I think with cement, that is the question that you also would need to ask yourself, like, well, has it shown to work? So we are concerned across the board. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jennifer Kunze.
Yes, thank you so much. My name's Jennifer Kunze. I'm the organizing director at Clean Water Action, and I live in Baltimore City. And I am here today to talk about the solid waste management section for the most part. There's a lot of good that Maryland could be doing in this sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And unfortunately, the draft report so far falls short on that. We could be accomplishing much, much more in this sector than the draft report is currently contemplating. There's no specific additional policies listed in the waste management sector, and with specific additional policies, we could be achieving so much more than 40% emissions reductions. Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, estimates that good solid waste management policies can reduce emissions in this sector by 84%. Just over double of what the Climate Pathway Report is projecting right now. And that looks like a lot of different things. That looks like specific policy mechanisms to fund new composting and recycling facilities. That looks like incentives to reduce waste production in the first place. That looks like expanding on our organic waste diversion mandate that's already in the books. And we'd like to see those specific policies listed in the additional policies section to get us further than that 40% emissions reductions. And the biggest additional policy that we'd like to see is a policy to recommend that Maryland stop incinerating our trash. Just a look at the graph of emissions in the solid waste sector that we saw a few moments ago shows how critical this is to further reducing emissions in solid waste. You can just take a look at it and see how much Maryland's just two trash incinerators pollute compared to all of the landfills that every single county in Maryland uses. And especially with the emissions reductions that are coming with the policies that are already on the books for landfills, the emissions from our two trash incinerators will be even more so ridiculously outsized in comparison to Maryland's landfills. Trash incineration really has no place in Maryland's future if we're acting seriously on climate. A recent peer-reviewed study showed that, quoting, incinerators emit more greenhouse gas emissions per unit of electricity produced than any other power source. They also emit more criteria air pollutants, that's what harms people's health, than replacement sources of energy. Incineration pollutes more than coal. It has absolutely no place in a climate policy. It's also a really significant EJ issue. Environmental justice organizations and communities impacted by Maryland's two trash incinerators have been clamoring for years that those incinerators be shut down and that incineration no longer be incentivized in Maryland's RPS. And the Climate Pathway Report, the final report in Maryland's future climate plan, really need to respond to those demands of the frontline communities that we no longer be burning our trash. It unfortunately doesn't accomplish anything to gesture at the equity issues with how we currently manage our waste without recommending those additional policies that will actually remedy them. Briefly, there's a recommendation also in the report to partially discount incinerator emissions, the reasoning being that they're biogenic. And that would be a huge mistake for Maryland to do because the biogenic waste that's being talked about is actually what is compostable. And composting that waste instead of incinerating it would actually sequester carbon in the ground. There's no reason to come up with a formula to reduce the emissions from incinerator on paper. And doing that would just hide those emissions that are still happening in the air and would not get us any closer to our climate goals. And then finally, I want to echo Jorge's comments before me, connecting trash incineration, woody biomass, and biogas. Maryland made a huge mistake when we decided to build the Baltimore trash incinerator in the 80s and the Montgomery County incinerator in the 90s. And we're still dealing with that colossal error now, decades later. We cannot afford to make the same mistake now at this moment on the biogas and the biomass industries. So the Pathway Report must recommend that we take these three polluters out of the RPS and make sure that they're not a part of the recommended 100% clean energy standard and not a part of Maryland's future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next, I see Julie Gorley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I live in Brunswick, Maryland, and I have been focusing a lot on the state's 2020 data center sales and use tax incentive law, and that the fact that the state is still very interested in attracting data centers, especially here in Frederick County. My concern is that data centers use enormous amounts of energy. And as if anyone else is following this knows, Dominion, Virginia has already said they can't supply enough power to Data Center Alley in Ashburn, Virginia, and down into Prince William County. Frederick County is with Potomac Edison. I don't know that Potomac Edison has done any kind of calculation yet, but some of the environmental groups that are aligned with aligned in opposing data center development because of its enormous electricity and water demand, believe that Potomac Edison won't be able to supply sufficient energy. My question, I guess, and comment is there any consideration being given by MDE, by the governor's office, to rethinking the 2020 law that came under Governor Hogan, and not be so anxious to attract data centers to this state, which will, by some calculations, more than, well, just in Frederick County alone, at the Quantum Loophole site, which is the site of the former East Alco aluminum smelter, the 22 data centers that Quantum Loophole wants to attract to that campus and create at least a 1 gigawatt facility would far more than double the entire state's electricity generation requirements, the electricity demand. And with coal-fired power plants and other sources of energy that are contributing to climate change, I guess I'm wondering and wish to comment that if the state, and would encourage the state to rethink the plan to attract data centers to the state and especially to Frederick County. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you cross paths with my family in Brunswick, tell them I say hi. I'm going to go next to Shilpa Shenvi. Shilpa, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will try to make this quick. My name is Shilpa Shenvi. I am with the Sierra Club Transportation Team. We asked that MDE work with the Maryland Department of Transportation to incorporate the following objectives into its final climate plan. First, please fix the transportation planning models and methods for project impact analysis to emphasize a state of good repair policy, one that prioritizes alternatives to highway expansion, accounts for induced demand, and requires that proposed highway projects don't cause a net increase in either greenhouse gas emissions or vehicle miles traveled. All anticipated increases in greenhouse gas emissions and VMTs from such a project need to be completely offset by car-free transportation projects, such as ones that make it easier for people to use public transportation, ride their bikes, and walk. Second, please develop a VMT reduction please develop a strategy that will lead to a 20% per capita VMT reduction below 2019 levels by 2030. The VMT reduction strategy should include improving and encouraging public transportation, creating favorable conditions for transit-oriented development, implementing transportation demand management, and building and improving cycling and pedestrian infrastructure. And finally, Maryland must take actions to ensure an equitable and smooth transition to zero-emission vehicles. Provide local government entities with the money and technical assistance they need to ensure that, starting in 2025, only transit and school buses that are zero-emission vehicles will be procured. Require that all sales of medium and heavy-duty vehicles in the state are zero-emission as of 2036. And enhance equity in the transition to electric vehicles by increasing access to charging in underserved urban and rural communities, at homes with people with disabilities, and in communities and residential buildings that don't have private parking or where residents are not able to install charging stations themselves. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak.
Thanks, Shilpa. Let's see. Just quick time check. It's about 7 o'clock, which also means that we've reached witching hour in my household. If you hear any screams and chaos in the background, don't be alarmed. It's my very active children. Next, I see, is it Dee Dar?
Yes, my name is Diane DeRigo. I am the Radioactive Waste Project Director at Nuclear Information and Resource Service. I live and my office is in Montgomery County. Nuclear Information and Resource Service is a national and international nonprofit that focuses on the dangers of nuclear power, waste, and radioactive emissions from nuclear power, and pushes for a replacement with clean renewables. Nuclear power makes climate worse. It steals the resources needed for real solutions. It is dirty, radioactively dirty, dangerous, expensive, too too slow, and it violates environmental justice principles at every step of the fuel chain. It's a waste. And in Maryland, we are at every reactor, we're continuing to generate both so-called low-level and high-level radioactive waste routinely with every watt of electricity that's generated. Waste that will be dangerous literally into the millions of years and for which we have no way to isolate. So it is great that the Maryland path forward is not planning for new nuclear, which would waste our money, resources, and effort. However, there are some assumptions about the existing 2 reactors at Calvert Cliffs that should be corrected. The reactors are currently licensed to operate into 2034 and 5, I believe. And there's an assumption in the path forward that there will be a license renewal into 2050. And rather than assuming that that will happen, when in fact these are some of the oldest reactors in the country, the plan should phase replacement into place, perhaps offshore wind. The report's assumptions about nuclear assume, as I said, that the Calvert Cliffs reactors will continue operating through 2050. They would be over 70 years old, and the federal subsidies and the nuclear power production credit, those expire in 2032, even before the current operating licenses expire, as I said, in 2034, and the other one's 2036. There are 2 statements on page 32 of the report that raise the need to have a contingency plan for closure of the Calvert Cliffs reactors. One, it says, we also assume planned retirements of coal-fired plants in Maryland and relicensing of existing nuclear generation facilities at Maryland's Calvert Cliffs. Relicensing is a precondition for Calvert Cliffs. It would be necessary to get relicensed to operate until 2050, and that is not a guarantee. Effectively, all of the 25 plus nuclear reactors that have closed in the country have done so well before their licenses have expired. Safety problems and or rising operating and maintenance costs have been the main factors. Old reactors face significant increases in costs.
Thank you.
And
We're going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Okay, increased safety problems. So we are asking that the assumption in the state's previously assumption that 2030 GGRA plan, but could be, I'm sorry, the assumption in line with the state's previous assumptions in the 2030 GGRA plan could impact the generation mix modeled here post 2030. So we're asking for replacement plans for nuclear, and we applaud that there is no plan for new nuclear.
Thank you very much. Let's see, next is Michael Sepanek?
Sepanek. It's okay. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so I wanted to comment on the transportation and building sections. So the report, I feel, needs to call for a large reduction in vehicle miles traveled, VMT, rather than the 0.6 increase projected. A reduction on the order, I don't know, of 10, 20% should really be called for. Furthermore, as disappointing as the projected 0.6% increase is, it appears to be, I don't know, based on what I'm seeing, it's just unrealistic. In the passenger miles by mode figure that I see on page 44 of the report, it projects a sharp reversal in 2025 of the currently climbing VMT. And based on the content of the report, that reversal, from what I'm reading, will be owed to smart growth policies and the currently non-existent cap and invest program. So in order for that reversal to VMT to come to pass, it seems like legislation creating those policies and programs they would need to be passed in the upcoming 2024 General Assembly session. So given the criticality of those two factors to reversing the current upward trend of VMT, it seems like the report needs to outline the specifics of the referenced smart growth policies and cap and invest program, by my estimation. So with that baseline bit of input established, so the report then needs to outline the measures needed to effect a significant needle moving reduction in VMT. Definitely not an increase. So possible measures that I would suggest are really an immediate moratorium on all highway expansions, a major upgrade to the MTA bus network that'll bring the convenience of travel by bus on par with travel by automobile, an end to all parking mandates and subsidies, and a major build out of protected alternative transportation infrastructure. And then with regards to the building sectors section, it focuses a lot on electrification and energy efficiency and such, and that's great. But it seems like a really big miss for the report to not make mention of allowing for and encouraging smaller housing types and footprints. The focus for corrective action here, I think, needs to be trained on local exclusionary zoning policies that don't allow for quote unquote missing middle housing types or ADU, accessory dwelling units. And there's no financial cost required to implement these zoning reforms to local codes. From an equity perspective, allowing for and encouraging smaller housing types and footprints is a huge win, as it would facilitate the development of truly affordable housing, not subsidized, but just affordable housing that is well integrated into successful, desirable, fully functioning communities. And it would also help foster the development of a robust ecosystem of really small scale entrepreneurial tradespeople, as they're going to be needed to build and convert these, envisioned isolated infill housing projects. And that's all I got to say. Thank you very much for the time.
As someone with an accessory apartment in my home in Silver Spring, I agree with many of those comments. Thanks. Next, I see Thaddeus Waterman. Thaddeus, it looks like you might be looking for the unmute button.
Sorry, I was trying to, I'm so used to Zoom that you can do it at the top right of the screen as well, that I was trying to click there and it wasn't working. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Zoom accounts are really pricey, but Google Meet works for us.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, just want to say thank you for this opportunity. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate everyone coming out and speaking on behalf of their communities. I think it's great to see this such public comment. My name is Thaddeus Waterman. I'm a Hyattsville resident. I'm also a member of the Maryland chapters of Citizens Climate Lobby. And something which I wanted to point out is I would really urge the Maryland Department of Environment to consider a state carbon fee and dividend policy in place of the cap and invest program that's listed. Part of the Maryland Pathway Report actually listed one of the issues is you actually have to make sure everything is being implemented. And a cap and invest strategy is just much more administratively burdensome than a carbon price. It's just going to add to the necessity of having to go through and make sure that companies are abiding by the limits that they were put under. You're going to have to actually set up marketplaces to kind of sell these credits and things. And on top of that, it actually just misses emissions. There's always going to be some polluters that aren't caught by a cap and invest program that a carbon price would just more efficiently cover. And so I would just really encourage to, when you guys are talking about those entire market strategies, to really consider a carbon fee and dividend approach. And I will mention that this is something that has been proposed in the Maryland legislation before. I'd encourage you to look at something called the Climate Crisis Environmental Justice Act. That was a bill proposed a few years ago, and it should be coming back this session, that actually approached a carbon fee and dividend policy in such a way that really had environmental justice communities in mind. And just really implore you to kind of pursue some of those options. I'd also recommend just to see more about prioritizing permitting reform. It takes a while to build things in the US, and we're going to need to build things much faster if we need to have the emission reductions we need to hit. And not only we need to have clean energy projects come online faster, we need to be able to build the transmission lines faster to make sure the clean energy gets from the solar panels, from the wind farms, even nuclear, if that is, I know some groups are against that, but any clean energy source, go from those sources to the homes and where they're needed. And that's just two things I want to comment on. Just again, thank you for the time, and I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Diana Conway.
Hi, good evening. My name is Diana Conway. I live in Montgomery County. Thanks for this opportunity tonight. I'm here with a bunch of different hats on. I'm an appointee to the Maryland Environmental Trust. I'm a founder and board member of the Montgomery Countryside Alliance, which is advocate for the Ag Reserve in Montgomery County. I'm president of Safe Healthy Playing Fields, trying to stop toxic synthetic turf fields that are unrecyclable and produce fabulous amounts of methane. I'm also chair of the environmental committee for the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club and a member of a whole bunch of environmental coalitions, which are well represented here tonight. I love the ambitious goals, and I appreciate being able to talk to you guys. And I thank you for working to literally save us all. But there's always a but in this kind of testimony. So the first one is, why are we keeping dirty energy? Why are we protecting polluting sources of energy? Why is biogas in the clean energy plan? Woody biomass, trash incineration, chicken litter. I mean, in addition to the methane, there's just so much other fabulous synergistic toxicity coming out of these, and the science is there. What's missing is the muscle and the political will. And I understand you guys are a department under an administration, but I'm here to try to fortify you. Incineration should not be cast as part of a solution. The plan should not allow incinerators to continue pumping out toxicity and poisoning our communities with public subsidies. I mean, it's kind of insulting. Why are we giving ratepayer dollars to polluters, even as we've seen a 43% increase in energy costs? And if we're going to pay more, shouldn't we be getting the better and cleaner energy? Why are we subsidizing Virginia's biomass to use as renewable, in quotes, when that state's own regulators consider it too dirty for their own new RPS? There are some specific questions I would love answers to. The first question that needs an answer is, where are the zero waste elements in the waste management section? And the second is something that was brought to my attention by a colleague, that MDE recently completed a report on the impact of climate change on drinking water. A colleague who'd specifically asked to it was told specifically it's indefinitely embargoed, and you can imagine what people are concluding from that. I'm told the report is by a hydrologist, and Mr. Hammond, I think I've got that right, in the MDE Water Sciences. And I would just point out that the PFAS that's going to be contaminating all of our drinking water is enormously expensive to remove and would probably take a chunk out of your budget in addition to others. So controlling those products, including the pipe output from incinerators, and also, by the way, from artificial turf, which is a fabulous source of PFAS, are easy ways to just stop adding to the toxicity. And the final point is the additional policies that were in the shaded parts of the graph chart slides seemed kind of modest. The additional policies part was smaller than the part that was indicated as industry sector reductions. And I mean, no offense to the private sector, but industry is not known for leading the charge on progress and progressivity. So if the state's policy or additional policies are doing less than that, there's room for growth. And finally, I'll just say, I hope you listen. I put the link in the chat, a VOLTS podcast, VOLTS, on grid enhancing technologies that are widely deployed across Europe. And one of them, called topology optimization, was estimated that it would have saved in congestion costs for PJM 50% in 2022. That's 50% of $2.5 billion. That is an inexpensive solution. Another one is advanced flow power controls, which basically feeds power out of congested intersections and into less congested circuits. And the last one is dynamic line reading, so that we don't have to use these super conservative estimates of what the line can carry in case of worst scenario, because it gives you a granular real-time read of conditions. And the increases in power line capacity could be between 10 and 35%. So in addition to the work that has to be done and paid for, there are really inexpensive, well-tested, well-proven steps that I hope you will consider and get your colleagues across the Maryland state government to consider. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Great points. Just a quick note on time. We have about 15 minutes remaining for tonight's session. We have about 8 hands up, so if people can try to keep to about that 2-minute limit, that'd be really helpful to get everyone through. Let's see, is it Tammy Wainwright?
Yes, hi, my name's Tammy Wainwright. I'm with 3P Protect Perryman Peninsula. And I'm just wondering, we're located in Harford County, and I'm just wondering what you're planning to do. What's the state's plan for the implementation of freight terminals in overburdened areas? Our area has been labeled as overburdened and underserved, and we have been fighting the development of a 5 million square foot warehouse freight terminal on a 711 acre farm. Does the state have any plans to halt the development of these mega warehouses?
That's a great question. It's out of my area of expertise, but I'm happy to bring that back to the department.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wandra, Ashley Williams, nice seeing you tonight.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to be as brief as possible. We did send in written comments and recommendations to the plan, but tonight I just want to stress, and I am speaking on behalf of Climate Exchange and the Rebuild Maryland Coalition, I just want to stress the importance of protecting disproportionately affected communities from harm, and to stress that Maryland citizens shouldn't have to pay for the state to reach its reduction goals. Polluters should pay. They should pay for the damage they've done and they've known about since the 1970s. So I'm happy to see that you do have some type of carbon pricing mechanism included in the plan. However, I must agree with that we don't think a cap and invest policy or program is the best for Maryland. Instead, we need a policy such as the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act that charges the fee to the polluters and takes the revenue and put it back in the community to uplift the environmental justice communities and to pay for projects that are outlined in the CSNA that really does not have the proper funding. And so this policy will generate about $18 billion over a 10-year plan, 10-year span. So it's significant. We want to ensure that the environmental justice communities, those that are disproportionately affected, don't get charged the fee. So there is a no pass-through provision in this particular policy that says that the companies cannot pass the fee down to the consumer. So we think that is needed to make sure that certain communities don't bear the burden of our solving our issue. And so with that, again, we've submitted our recommendations. We're available to discuss further this plan, but we just believe that this is a better policy, a better mechanism for the state of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Wandra. Let's see, next is Morel Goldsmith.
Hi. Thank you for this opportunity to participate. I'm Mirla Goldsmith. I'm from Montgomery County. And I wanted to point out that the thing that struck me the most when I read the plan was the current policy scenarios, how our emissions are going to, on almost I think all of your graphs, emissions are going to increase significantly without the implementation of this plan, or obviously an improved plan. And I think that's really important to communicate to the public, to really stress. You stressed at the beginning that Maryland has reduced our emissions, but if we don't do something, our emissions are going to increase. They're not even just going to stay the same. So I guess that's a communications point that I'd like to share with you. I'm a public transit rider myself, and I was going to say a lot of things about the section of your report, which I believe gives short shrift to the issues of zoning and smart growth. But Michael Sapaniak said everything for me. So I just want to endorse what he said earlier on that area. And then just finally, I would like to see even more ambition in this report. There are certain areas where maybe the recommendations seem realistic, but they could be a lot more ambitious and creative. For example, in the area of distributed energy. So I want to commend you on the report as it stands, but encourage you to make it even more ambitious in your recommendations to the governor and the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. And I feel like this has been my primary job recently, trying to set expectations at a reasonable level for what you all are going to clearly read in our December plan. We've heard over the last few months since the Pathway Report came out, lots of great ideas about detailed proposals to be included in the plan. Don't be surprised if we don't include and able to expand on all of the great ideas that we've heard. There's only so much that we're able to fit into one plan by December with this new administration. So just trying to set expectations at a realistic level about the level of detail that we'll be able to include over the coming months. I see Sheldon Fishman.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. It's I'm trying to be very. Can you hear me? Okay, my camera doesn't seem to be turning on, but
yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, there's nothing beautiful to see anyway there. I want to expand on what Diana Conway was talking about with just a couple of small points. And I'm with I live in Montgomery County, and I'm with the National Safe Healthy Playing Fields Coalition. And we just to point out that a grass soccer field or football field is, in your words, a sink. It's sequestering greenhouse gas, whereas a synthetic turf field is, of course, generating more greenhouse gas and other issues. But the good news is that if you ban all new synthetic turf fields, you will save money. A state-of-the-art grass field costs about a third of what a synthetic turf field costs. So we haven't had a lot of things that we can say, hey, here's how we can save some money. And even more important from a cost point of view is that the synthetic turf fields are a fossil fuel Ponzi scheme. Every synthetic turf field, of course, has to be replaced and removed and disposed. And of course, all of those words to an environmentalist are terrible. After 8 years, and a real grass field does not. And again, to be so if you take on the fossil fuels industry and the plastic part of that by not spending public funds on new synthetic turf fields, you'll get some benefits in some of the other battles that you have with the fossil fuel industry. And if you want to get really bold, you can start to rip out some of the existing synthetic turf fields and replace them back with state-of-the-art grass fields like the NFL is doing and Pfeiffer Soccer is doing. And in the interest of time, I have 35 more minutes of comments, but I'll stop here.
Thanks. Well, feel free to submit written comments, and we will do our best to read everything that comes in by the October 15th deadline. Next is Gabby R.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. My name's Gabby Ross. I live here on the lower eastern shore of Maryland, and currently am working for Sentinels for Eastern Shore Health, as well as Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs here that represent the lower 3 counties. And one of the biggest things that we've been involved with in the last couple of years is reclaiming the renewable portfolio standard in the state of Maryland. This is something that is definitely 100% achievable. We will definitely need, all of the departments and state legislators working together to fix this, but this is something that's not addressed adequately in this report, which is increasing a lot of concerns for residents down here on the shore. So we decided to, work with these coalitions to reclaim the RPS and really focus on fixing the polluting energy sources that are currently getting taxpayer dollars. Methane is probably the biggest topic here on the shore, and factory farm methane is currently being propped up. It currently also gets different taxpayer dollars in the Animal Waste Technology Fund. So the possibility of factory farm methane being able to double dip into our taxpayer funds is completely and utterly disrespectful to the environmental justice communities that are currently dealing with these methane digesters being promoted and on shore. And one of the biggest things is currently the Maryland RPS designates 2 out-of-state facilities, and they are both in Ohio, and one of them is a constant polluter who has received several different violations. So here on the Eastern Shore now, these types of facilities are extremely costly. They're generally not profitable without subsidies, incentives, and continuous feedstocks. And its inclusion in the RPS provides an unwanted financial incentive to add new greenhouse gas emitting technology to our grid under the guise of renewable energy. And it's on the public's dime. Please consider taking out the polluting industries out of the RPS and start addressing these energy issues as EJ issues for the state of Maryland. All of this type of technology supports constructions of pipelines, refineries, digesters, all of which are promoted to cross wetlands, streams, the paths of least resistance. And of course, they're crossing through our most vulnerable communities. So I'd really like to see this addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. And I see hands up from 5 more people. I'm happy to stay on to hear the comments from those 5 people. It's Lucy, Emmanuel, Angeli, Daniela, and Jim. Obviously, welcome everyone else to stay on as well and hear to the dialogue. So next up is Lucy.
Thank you, and congratulations to Dr. Kennedy and your team for completing your modeling and presenting it with recommendations. I know it represents a lot of work and a lot of thought and analysis has gone into it. And my question is whether you have considered the fact that in 2020, the greenhouse gas emissions might have been lowered due to everyone staying home and the slowdown of the economy at that time, and whether you can address that and maybe account for it in your projections into the future.
Yes, we did account for that. So we built into the model a trajectory that takes into account the COVID dip and then the expected rebound that comes after that. Yes.
Okay, I missed that in reading the thing. Thank you. And I want to I also want to echo the people from Western Maryland who were speaking up about and encourage you. I'm looking forward to the results when you can include the effects of carbon sequestration from those wonderful forests in Western Maryland. And there were other people who made comments that I wanted to echo, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And just wanted to share also, when my team released Maryland's greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2020, and at the same time we released a progress report that also suggested that Maryland's emissions would have likely been about 26% below 2006 levels had it not been for COVID. So it's a very good point that you've made there. COVID certainly had an impact, especially on transportation sector emissions in 2020. So when we kind of control for that, we see that 2020 would have likely been about a 26% reduction had it not been for COVID. Let's see, Emmanuel.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. No, I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much for staff for this body of work. My name is Emmanuel Wagner. I'm a Montgomery County resident. My background is over a decade of work in the clean energy industry, especially hydrogen fuel cells and biomass heating. I have a number of issues with the report as it's currently written, and so thank you for listening. First, I feel the public input process was lacking. I followed California's energy planning for quite some time, the ARB scoping plan, the CEC's integrated energy policy report, the integrated resource planning from the PUC. All these plans hold workshops in the beginning of the development of a report on each sector, and they collect input from energy experts and affected industries at that time. And then only with that feedback, staff develops plans and modeling and a draft report, which is then again available for public comment. I wish the process would have been somewhat similar here, so that we can also comment on the assumptions and not just the results. But my biggest issue, in my opinion, is the lack of the economic modeling. The plan is ambitious and will cost money. We have to be honest about that. And there's a discussion about economic benefits, but the report should be very clear about how much electricity, gas, and other sources of energy will cost the residents, the industry, and the commercial sectors in the future. California is already seeing massive spikes in the cost of electricity, 65 to 75 cents of cost of power per kilowatt during peak times. And they're only at 40% renewable generation right now. So their costs are continuously increasing. The modeling should show what the cost of electricity is for end users in Maryland and what inputs have been used as well. You know, what are you modeling the cost of electricity to be? So also the report should show what each policy will cost in terms of CO2 abatement. So how many dollars per ton of CO2 abated will each policy cost? Only with that and with such an assessment, it'll allow us to identify the low-hanging fruits and a comparison of effective and less effective strategies. Without that, a lot of this, there's a lot of great ideas, but we really don't know, are they going to be really cheap, really expensive, and so forth. So that really economic modeling is missing. There's a focus on unprecedented growth in the wind and solar generation, despite the challenges that these industries are already facing. And it seeks to decommission natural gas plants within the next decade. So the plan is proposing to increase the number of intermittent generation and decommissioning baseload power generation. New nuclear generation is not considered, despite new reactors going online in several other states across the country. More importantly, the discussion of energy storage is almost entirely absent, even though energy storage, especially long-term and seasonal storage, will be crucial to handle all this additional intermittent generation. Model output shows that half of Maryland's energy generation will be imported by 2030. And that's depending on how the language is interpreted. That'll actually be matched with hourly RECs to be clean. That's entirely untested proposal. What does the model say about the cost of those hourly RECs? Moreover, are those imports, if those are all imported, that means all of these energy jobs will not be in Maryland. So I hope the plan is not to deindustrialize Maryland in order to meet our GHG emissions, which I know it's not. I'm just saying that's one way of meeting our goals, right? It would be important for the plan to develop several different scenarios, which is what California is doing, to assess the trade-offs among the different policy options, such as continuing gas plants, building new nuclear, having mixed generation, and not only solar and wind. Lastly, Maryland's strategy is heavily focused on electrification. And that's a strategy that's pursued in California, and which has a much different climate than Maryland. For example, early results from electric school bus pilots in Vermont show that show an 80% reduction in range during cold winter days. Any EV driver will attest to those challenges, and not and they will not be suitable to all drivers in the state, especially rural areas. So I urge you to add optionality in our choices. And the report doesn't really give that. It's mandating a lot of behavioral changes from residents, and requiring people to change their behavior rather than giving them option is usually not good or smart policy. Okay,
Thanks.
almost done. Sorry, do I have another minute? Sorry.
We're a little over time now, so if we can shift to the next person, that'd be good.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your listening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, Dr. Kennedy's team did present their assumptions to the mitigation working group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change over the course of many months. So I hear you in terms of, you know, wanting a robust public input process. We utilize the Climate Commission for that public input, feeding into the modeling activity that the team did. Anjali.
Yes, thank you so much for staying on to hear comments. My name is Anjali Galati. I'm a Harford County resident that does work in the DMV region as well as Baltimore City. On behalf of Interfaith Power and Light DMV, we were so happy to see that Maryland is proposing to phase out gas-burning water heaters and space heaters and to shift to an all-electric construction code for new buildings in the draft climate plan. Our communities have been documenting the harms of gas burning and are looking to the state to support them in getting off of fossil fuels in our homes and congregations and the other buildings where we live, work, play, and pray. So we cheer this part of the proposal and support its swift implementation. Thanks to NASA's new instrument, as well as other air quality monitoring instruments, air pollution is now sourced geographically across the United States, and we can pinpoint which communities are the most affected by poor air quality related to harmful emissions from burning fossil fuels. So it's important to look at these issues from an intersectional lens. It's no mistake nor mystery how intracity heat islands, low-income communities, and communities of color are the most vulnerable to the dangers of the climate crisis. Black children, more than any other demographic, have the highest rate of hospitalizations related to asthma and other respiratory illnesses. Now, we don't have many other chances to keep getting this wrong, and we need to make sure that we're disseminating this information in a way that benefits community health. The ambitious endeavors set aside by the state and working groups can't be achieved without necessary funding. So I've also done some work with Climate Exchange Maryland. The Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act is projected to raise up to $8.8 billion in green investment revenue between 2025 and 2034, with an annual average budget of $880 million. The destructive impacts of climate change with a history of disparity in Maryland is addressed by the CCEJ's market-based solutions, also addressed by Wandra and Thaddeus early each night. We need to emphasize efforts to collect locally tailored data for locally tailored solutions. We can change building practices and urban planning. It's vital to leverage all the investments in all the communities, namely those lacking environmental amenities, from trees to cooler surfaces to greening appliances, etc. There are ways to incorporate shade that also generate renewable energy that we know of, such as solar canopies. If we're going to eliminate health disparities related to indoor gas emissions, the first step is making it known how harmful breathing in methane is, and how often we do so indoors at levels far higher than what EPA has set safe for outdoor standards. I had the opportunity to organize with Action in Montgomery, or AIM, to do indoor gas emissions testing in apartments around Silver Spring. And when we tested the stoves indoors with all 4 burners on plus the oven, the gauges read not 1 time, not 2 times, nor 3 times, but from 4 to 7 times over the limit of methane emissions deemed safe outdoors by EPA's air quality standards. And I know the gas stoves is one of the most politicized climate issues right now. So talking about other infrastructure reform very briefly, I go on BaltimoreCitySchools.org to view the plan for schools without AC in the last few weeks ago, when we had not 1, but 2 days of over 100-degree heat. And the plan is that 20 schools in Baltimore City dismiss early or close altogether. That plan is not acceptable. Students from dozens of schools missing out on school due to extreme heat is not acceptable. Heat mitigation is a topic that doesn't always fit neatly, but it is related to infrastructure, and it's important to emphasize that every single heat-related illness and death is preventable. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And as one of Maryland's Silver Spring residents who recently updated his old gas range to an induction range and couldn't be happier about it, I certainly hope that the support structure comes into play so that everyone who wants to make that change has the capability of doing so. Daniela.
Hello, thank you so much for this opportunity. I live in Poolsville area, actually in Boyd's. I'm new to this area and I am part of the North American Food Systems Network. And I also am one of the volunteers of the Zero Waste Montgomery County. I'd like to congratulate you for your efforts so far and just try to nudge your direction towards being more inclusive about the section that is related to waste reduction, specifically with food. As somebody that is also part of Green Latinos and member of, like I'm Mexican American, I really feel like there is a big black spot on, blind spot on the report about food systems and how much of the food miles are not considered and the food resiliency that the Maryland in general could be fostering in addition to the climate action. So all of that food waste capacity in the soil is been a little controversial in terms of not having clear data of how composting actually stabilizes nitrogen and phosphorus on the soil in addition of being a carbon sink. And so it doesn't necessarily, it does not threaten the Chesapeake Bay. On the contrary, it helps, but there is lack of information. I don't know if that's a part of the scope of your plan or not, but I really like you to consider that in addition of the wonderful carbon sink calculations that you have for the forest, you include the capacity of that food waste that is not being considered currently, because it's really going to improve. Yeah, I have children too. It's going to improve the resiliency of the area. So it's not just about carbon neutrality, but our emergency capacity and our resiliency. And so what I'm trying to say is, on the transportation section, are you considering the food miles? Because by having more food being produced locally, that could also reduce that other section. So that's part of the blind spot. It's not just about putting the food waste in the compost, but having more food here will reduce the intake of food from outside, which ultimately will be also an environmental justice situation for those places where we're taking all those nutrients and we're currently burning them. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. And you're reminding me that once we go through the last two commenters, I'll have to shift to bedtime duty to get the kids to bed here. There are two more people, Jim and then Robin will have the last word. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Mark. I'll be very brief. I'm a senior citizen living in a high rise in Silver Spring that relies on natural gas heating. My comment is requested in the final report to address how residents, especially seniors, will be able to afford the cost of converting condominiums, especially older ones, to electrical heating. Thank you.
Yeah, great comment. And an issue that's front and center for the Department of the Environment and the Maryland Energy Administration, which are co-chairing a building energy transition implementation task force right now that by December 1st has a deadline of producing a report looking at exactly this issue of what additional state funding may be needed to help transition the building sector to a highly electrified and decarbonized building sector. So among the other reports that you can read of ours in December, you can add that one to your list. Robin Lewis.
Thank you. I'm Robin Lewis. I'm the Director for Climate Equity at Interfaith Power and Light, DMV. And first, I want to agree with so many people that went before me about trash incineration, pulling that out of the RPS, and the other numerous comments people made about vulnerable communities. And my coworker, Anjali, who also gave you props about phasing out gas burning appliances and HVAC systems. want to thank you for considering those things. You know, what I have to say is overburdened and underserved communities are extremely vulnerable to indoor air pollution and other pollutants. Additionally, many low-income residents can't afford to make their homes healthy by retrofitting them or retrofitting their old appliances to electric or induction stoves, which would be great, but a lot of people can't afford to do that. So I would ask that we please consider doing something similar to like DC's Healthy Homes Act, which they're voting on, or hopefully it will pass this fall, which helps low and moderate income folks. It actually helps them to convert to electric and retrofit their homes by helping to finance and fund it. That's a good way to use some of the funding that Maryland will be receiving from various sources, federal and state sources. But that will be a good thing to do for homes that are old and for renters and for others that can't afford to retrofit their homes. So I would suggest that we consider doing that as a way to help people who want to go electric and can't. That's also a way to consider with regard to electric cars, because those things are great and wonderful, but if you can't afford it, then that's going to be a problem. So what I suggest is that we consider that as we move forward. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Robin. And I can assure you and everyone else that leaving no one behind in this transition, figuring out how to provide the financial support, especially for Maryland's low to moderate income population and disadvantaged communities, and just front and center in MDE's mind, and I think the minds of our agencies and the governor's office as we think about how to achieve this transition to a clean energy future. I really appreciate the time that you all took to participate in tonight's meeting, the comments that you shared, the questions that you posed. You've given my team even more to chew on than what we collected in all of the previous listening sessions. So thank you so much. Quick thanks. You know, this is actually the end of the road for us in terms of these listening sessions. We're shifting just to written comments here on out. Just really want to quickly acknowledge the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, Kathleen, Shannon, others on the line. You've been really great partners in this project and in supporting the state in developing its greenhouse gas emission reduction plan, which is due at the end of December. So enjoy the holidays, make it to 2024, and on day one of 2024, if I've met my deadline, go to our website and see if we have a new plan published there. All right, take care, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. I hope to be in touch soon with you guys.
Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.